Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the eTrackit rollout webinar. We'll get started in just a moment here. We still have some folks trickling in. Just as a quick reminder, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to everybody afterwards if you agreed to receive communications at the time of the registration. And the recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. Great. Well, it looks like we have mass here, so we'll get started. Welcome. My name is Callie Weldon. I am the Standards Engagement Manager. You might have heard from myself and my colleague Evonne about this topic of eTrackit in the past, but we're very excited today to be rolling out the first commercially available version of the eTrackit program for the GRS and the RCS. And so you'll hear from me a bit later about the engagement plan and our goals for industry engagement with the rollout. But first, I'll hand it over to my colleague Evonne to talk you through eTrackit and the progress we've made.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Welcome, everyone. As Kelly mentioned, really excited that you guys have joined us today. I wanted to kickstart today's session by taking a little step back and consider the big picture. Why are we striving for traceability? And the rationales behind the Trackit traceability program. So hopefully you guys are all aware and have heard of our Climate Plus strategy. It is really at the heart of everything we do. Essentially, it is to get on the 1.5 degree pathway, which means it is aligned to a 45% reduction of greenhouse gas of pre-spin fiber materials by 2030. Connected to this is the goal to improve interrelated positive impacts on soil, water, and biodiversity. So what does this have to do with traceability? For starters, the law requires it. Since 2015, there have been a slew of regulations coming into play. Some on claim, some disclosure, some on proof of impact, others on removal of forced labor. But essentially, what ties it all together is that we need traceability in order to deliver all of them. And most notably of late are some of the regulations, Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, Green Claims Directive, Textile Labeling Regulations, the AJAC French Law, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and this is just really to name a few of them. Brands have also made a number of commitments to reduce the impact on the planet, but the problem is how opaque the supply chain currently is. A UNECE report in 2019 showed that majority of the top 100 brands have sustainable material targets in place, but really only 34% of these companies can track and trace their value chain. And of that, half of them only have visibility to their immediate suppliers. And lastly, mitigating the risk is also an important driver, managing the risk of continuous or sustainable supply of raw materials, the risk of legal penalties in certain cases, the risk of losing out on competition, and ultimately the risk of losing business. And related to all this is how we make sure that one is making positive impact on the planet to accurately reflect what you put on the label and claims, how to ensure that that is proving a positive impact, and also to preserve the product and brand integrity. Next slide, please. So in 2020, we engaged Accenture, the consulting firm, to help us develop our digital strategy and to design, as part of that, our traceability architecture or roadmap. In that process, we made some discoveries that ultimately became the guiding principles, if you will, on our traceability roadmap. The first principle is that there is never ever going to be a one traceability system that will meet all the needs of the entire industry. Each solution provider has its own unique selling point, and there are many reasons why a brand would choose one solution over another. The second principle we recognize is that wherever possible, we should, in fact, we must leverage on existing systems and solutions, because we all have enough to do as it is to try to meet to the 2030 goals without reinventing the wheel. And thirdly, technology evolves really, really quickly. We all know this with the influx of machine learning and AI and all the rest. And system development is really not Textile Exchange's core competency. Our competency is convening, harmonizing, and creating standards. That's what we're known for, especially in the fiber material space. And so these is what we want to leverage on. So these three guiding principles led us to believe that what we have to create is not one system or one single traceability system, but really an interoperable ecosystem of solutions. Next slide, please. So that is pretty much what Trackit traceability program is. So just to set that landscape, it is an interoperable ecosystem of solution that tracks certified material across the supply chain back to its certified source. So within that, there are three levels of verification within traceability that we recognize. Site level, which verifies what is being carried on at the site conforms to a sustainability or operational criteria. Transactional level, which verifies that the product and the quantity exchanged throughout the supply chain is within the certified scope and can be reconciled against the inventory, and the physical material level, which authenticates the presence of the certified material in the product. So when we look at traceability, credible traceability requires the interplay of verification at site, transaction, and physical material levels. What is traced, how it is traced, and the assurance levels very much depends on the chain of custody and the requirements of the standard. For us, Trackit covers transaction verification and site level verification, and the two pathways essentially differentiate in the way we manage transaction verification. As far as scope and site verification is concerned, that maintains quite consistently across the two traceability pathways. Next slide, please. So there are three phases when we look at the Trackit roadmap, because the previous slide, we speak to how the overall game plan is, but how do we get there? So we've broken it up into three phases. The first phase is really about creating a central repository. We call it the shared measurement system for existing certification, especially scope certifications, which is governed by the scope, which governs really the scope of all the transactions. So that must firstly be in place. So the phase one really looks at establishing that central repository to process, meaning to collect, ingest, standardize, and also to report out this standard set of information across the supply chain. It looks at harmonizing data that we collect across 31 certification bodies, centralizing the scope certificate data, centralizing the transaction certificate data, and trying to tie and connect the transaction certificates together. In terms of architecture, phase one is pretty much complete. We're now looking at improving the data completeness as well as quality and making this process a lot more efficient. Next slide, please. So the next phase is really what we're here about today. It is about introducing an alternative traceability pathway, and it is about launching eTrackit. And the first use case is the TextileGenesis. And when we say the first use case, we mean that eTrackit is really about moving from PDF certificates to an online transactions. So going back to our interoperable framework, we're really looking at being able to scale and expand this across solution providers. And TextileGenesis is our first use case to do this. Once we've established that, we will be looking at integrating TextileGenesis in this particular case with our shared measurement system. And before that, we do also need to establish data standards or extend those data standards that has already been applied to dTrackit across to eTrackit as well. Next slide, please. Phase three is really about establishing Trackit as a clearinghouse for certified transactions. So what this includes is establishing a stakeholder portal. We're doing that anyway as part and parcel of Textile Exchange's rollout in managing our engagement with the industry. But it is, in this particular case, we are extending that to all our certificate information. And the reason why we want to do that is so that a certified organization can log in and be able to see their own data. And that one of the critical element is the establishment or the implementation of a unique identifier, which is coming into play at the beginning of 2024. Also to introduce assurance features within the portal. The second portion is also to scale eTrackit. That means not only expanding that outside of TextileGenesis to other solution providers as well. And the third is really establishing that reconciliation between certified volumes across the different solution providers. Pretty much the same way that we're establishing in dTrackit across the certification body, we'll apply that same model across eTrackit across the solution providers, establishing, therefore, the eTrackit entire model as a clearinghouse. Next slide, please. When we're talking about the Trackit traceability system, we're really not just looking to build a traceability mechanism as on its own. So if we look back a couple of slides ago, our ambition is really to enable us as an industry to be able to monitor and track our progress against the 45% reduction by 2030. And in order to do this, we've created the shared measurement system as an overarching architecture, and Trackit is a part of that architecture in the sense that that information provides the backbone architecture and interrelates and interoperable against the other information that we're also collecting. So essentially, if you want to look at it that way, the Trackit sort of ecosystem of solutions sits within a broader framework of interoperable solutions or systems. The next slide really kind of shows from a user perspective what this all means. It really means a suite of integrated tools to help companies and the industry track and measure the impact of preferred materials towards the Climate Plus goals. And Trackit, as you can see, is the center of this and the backbone of all our solutions. Next slide, please. So about eTrackit. Just to do a quick recap, first and foremost, eTrackit is an alternative method of transacting certified volume. This is big. For many brands who are using traceability solutions, they have to do this on top of transaction certificates. Following the recognition first principle that I spoke to a couple of slides ago, Textile Exchange, we've chosen to work with existing solution providers to customize their traceability solution according to our chain of custody as an alternative method. So, again, doing a way to have to use transaction certificate and then use a traceability solution on top of that, but to have both of them combined into one. And to be able to use that, the e-transaction, we call it, to transact certified volume across the supply chain at a product level. Since everything is online, real-time digital inventory is possible and visible. And because it all sits within the same framework, it ensures the peer-to-peer validation of e-transactions within a closed-loop supply chain. And what that means in the accounting terms, for those who are familiar with accounting, it means it's a zero-sum supply chain. If X volume goes in, only X can go out, and you can only sell however much volume that you have in stock or in your inventory. Next slide, please. This slide really shows you conceptually how eTrackit works, or electronic Trackit works. Within the TextileGenesis platform, it operates as opposed to in the transaction certificates where we have disparate certification body systems across the supply chain, which we then need to reconcile. For eTrackit, all the eTrackit transactions happen within this one single platform. So in principle, suppliers apply an e-transaction on the platform, upload supporting evidence like shipping documents and invoices. The system validates the supplier has a scope certificate in place and the e-transaction falls within that scope. And in the future, this can be derived from the digital Trackit through the integration. The system also validates that the e-transaction, again, supporting documents, that there's sufficient virtual inventory, and if all checks out, the certification bodies are notified to verify and approve. And third-party certification body approval is really important and remains key to the entire eTrackit model. And once the e-transaction is approved, the system will draw on the virtual inventory, and that inventory is then moved from the seller to the buyer. Next slide, please. One point to note is that TextileGenesis is a multi-party system. And by multi-party, what we really mean is that it operates on multiple, it's a traceability solution for multiple sustainability systems. In the TextileGenesis case, they do transact also for a variety of man-made cellulosic fibers and also US Cotton Trust Protocol. And what this means is that one system, when you, a supplier, perform or carries out a transaction, you can essentially carry out one transaction for multiple sustainability systems. You don't have to do it multiple times. So this is one of the reasons why we selected TextileGenesis as the first use case. Next slide, please. Some of the key principles of eTrackit. There are 5 specific ones we want to call out. First is on roles. For roles, the process roles, if you're familiar with our standards, we have a lot of business rules that are within the transaction certificate policy. And a lot of these rules are baked into the system already because those process categories are tied to the roles, and the roles are then mapped to those business rules. So instead of having to comply or conform to these rules individually, the system will basically only allow certain transactions that fall within those rules that are predefined. In terms of product creation, it unlike transaction certificates, it operates on an article level and includes also fiber characteristics for additional information. For particularly RCS and GRS, it also includes additional information on material declaration. But one must take note that for eTrackit, as it stands today, except for first processes, all inputs must be e-transactions to e-transactions. So at this point in time, we cannot mix the input from transaction certificate into eTrackit, except for the first processor. For waste calculation, the waste range is predefined per role, but that can be customized based on certification body's approval. The system will calculate the waste based on the input and the output, and anything outside of the range, which again, as I mentioned, requires the approval of certification body. The other important thing to remember about eTrackit, if you want to compare it with transaction certificates, is that eTransaction covers a broader scope than the legal change of ownership. So when we look at transaction certificate, basically we're looking at a seller selling to a buyer, and that happens across the supply chain. But for eTrackit, it also looks at key product transformation. So for example, if you're a completely vertically integrated supplier, you will still need to declare, for example, where the recycle happened and where the yarn is spun, and then where the fabric is made, instead of having it all fall within a particular vertical scope. But however, in order to maintain sort of the same level of chain of custody, if you will, based on our standards, only external transactions or e-transactions will need CB's approval. Internal ones don't. It is basically only to register those key transformation stages. Lastly, the last principle is really on transparency. Traceability map is for brands only. Otherwise, the visibility is based on one up, one down, pretty much the same as transaction certificates. And for brands who are wanting visibility of their indirect supplier, they can request for that visibility, and the supplier will need to opt in to disclose their identity. Next slide, please. I won't go too much into the detail because that will be covered during the onboarding, except to say that the eTrackit workflow on the TextileGenesis platform looks something like this. You sign into account, you do have to register, sign into the account. Basically, you select a role. And as I mentioned, the role will then define the business rules and dictate the type of processes that can occur. You create your facilities based on the scope certificate that in itself requires certification body's approval. You then create the products. Again, those are dictated by the roles and also whatever that you've created within the facilities. And then after that, you can create an e-transaction. And when you do, it does require a certification body's approval before it is then moved to the buyer's inventory. Next slide, please. For every single e-transaction, you can have a receipt, but it is important to remember that these are receipts. So think of it kind of like an e-banking system, where after you've transferred a particular amount of money, and in this case, an inventory, you can get a receipt, but those in itself is not a certificate. The authentication of the material that is transacted remains within the system itself. However, for every transaction that happens there, you could print, for example, an e-transaction receipt. Next slide, please. What is shown on the screen is basically the traceability map for brands. As I mentioned before, only brands have visibility to the traceability map, and the brands will be able to see their entire chain, but they will not be able to see the names of their indirect supplier for confidentiality and privacy reasons, unless the supplier opts in to disclose their identity. Producers can see the supply chain, but only in terms of how the volume transfers across the supply chain, and will not have the supplier visibility across the supply chain. Next slide, please. So in terms of benefits to the standard system, we see a huge amount of benefits to the standard system. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. It increases the efficiency in the certification data lifecycle, because as mentioned, you get pretty much real-time movements or inventory volume, and also you get the transaction data happening pretty much real-time. It reduces the manual handling of data as well, because everything is pretty much put into the platform, so certification bodies will be able to refer to the information that is already there. It also increases the integrity of the chain of custody to deliver provenance and impact, because it's all within the same supply, and brands can basically track it to its source. It tracks the flow of physical material at the article level. So unlike transaction certificates, so you kind of have to wait from products to then shipments to then transaction certificate. In this case, we are tracking it at the article level for a particular product. And lastly, I've already mentioned, this is a closed loop supply chain coupled with peer-to-peer validation, so that increases the integrity of the chain of custody within the solution itself. Next slide, please. So benefits to the supply network. This will decrease the certification paperwork and admin work, especially once the system stabilizes and we can create integration between, for the information to automatically flow between, let's say, a PLM or an ERP system directly into the traceability solution. It will also reduce the redundant request for documentation, because all the information exists all in one place. It increases the upstream transparency, but then also preserves the privacy requirements that the supply chain needs for now. There is also an opportunity for suppliers to be able to, as I mentioned, carry out one particular e-transaction for multiple sustainability systems in one platform. It improves the integrity of the transactions, and it provides real-time transaction information as well as inventory data. Okay, So I've spoken a lot now. I'm going to pass it to Callie now to speak about how we're intending to roll out to the industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Evonne. So as of today, we are having the rollout webinar, and I'm going to talk through a little bit about what this means. We're being really intentional with the word rollout versus launch, because it is still a process for brands to get set up in the system. And there's a series of discovery phase events that need to occur before a brand could start conducting e-transactions in their supply network. So I'll talk through what that looks like, but first, just to give a quick update of progress to date, and then some of the pilots that we're also conducting for future standard scopes. So we're in November of 2023, brand registration may begin, and I'll talk through what that looks like. In January of 2024 is when e-transactions could theoretically start if a brand has full eligibility, their purchase orders are eligible, and the certification body network is onboarded in the system. And January of 2024 is when TextileGenesis is able to start e-transactions based on their 2.0 launch of the system. Really quickly with OCS and RAF, we're currently piloting this scope, these two scopes, and really it's more of a proof of concept for the OCS and the RAF versus the actual e-transactions themselves. We had that proof of concept with the GRS and the RCS pilot last year, and so now we are taking those learnings and conducting a pilot for OCS and RAF to make sure that the organic content and the animal fiber content can also flow through this e-transaction system. So in this pilot, the supplier onboarding phase is in progress. It's nearly completed. We're conducting trainings with the suppliers and getting them into the system. And so the overall pilot is expected to be completed in Q1 of 2024. And then our RDS pilot is planned for Q2/Q3 of 2024. Going back to GRS and RCS, so the stakeholder engagement plan is in phases, as I mentioned, as part of the rollout. So we'll be launching a lot of different support tools, documentation, demo and drop-in sessions for the industry to help make sense of where the industry is at as an individual brand, if you're curious if you're eligible or not. And then if you want to help onboard your supply network, if you want to look at the system more in depth and get a demo of what does the actual portal look like, how do you log in, what would a demo dashboard show you. So all of that will be coming. We have launched some of this information on the certification body side in October. As you can imagine, the system also requires that certification bodies are onboarded and trained to be able to approve and conduct e-transactions in the system. So our eTrackit policy for which governs certification bodies and then users was launched in October. You can find that on our website. We also launched our eTrackit CB training program. So all certification bodies by a certain date, which I'll talk about in a moment, will be registered for eTrackit, meaning that they'll have had to gone through the training of how to conduct e-transactions. This month, November, we're hosting the webinar, and then everybody who registered for the webinar on November 30th will receive both a follow-up of the recording, these slides, but also more information about the rollout. So we're launching a press release that will be included in that email. We're also launching a quick guide, which includes information about how to tell whether or not you're eligible for the use of eTrackit. It provides really quick points as to what next steps would be for a brand who is eligible and interested and what they should begin to do. And then in December, we're launching a much larger, more robust brand toolkit for use of the system itself. We're also launching a supplier toolkit, which will help suppliers make sense of the system and help brands make a case for their supply network as to why it might be beneficial for them to onboard to eTrackit. And we'll also be hosting a series of demo and drop-in sessions. We have both North American and then European accommodating times here. And so it's really a chance for anyone who's interested to be able to ask questions. We'll do demos of the system. We can log into different views of what it might look like for a supplier versus a brand. and really just have an hour to open the floor up to any questions that might come up during that time. So feel free after this webinar to register for those different drop-in sessions if you are interested, and we'll continue to host these into 2024 as well. If you are a brand that's interested in using eTrackit, the first step really is brand certification to the GRS or the RCS. This is necessary in order to even begin to start your supply chain discovery phase, is to have that brand level scope certificate. And so for a lot of brands, this will be where you start and where you stay for a little while you work towards your scope certificate at the brand level. We do have a lot of information and more webinars to come about brand certification. So if you're still working on that and you're trying to figure out what brand certification looks like, you can come to our team, but that is the first step of being able to be eligible for eTrackit use. Then there'll be a supply chain discovery phase, which I'll go into a little bit more, but essentially Textile Exchange, you'll register with us and be able to receive diagnostics about your supply chain. So we'll run through eligible certified supply chains in your network and provide you an output of a diagnostic report that essentially states, you as a brand have this many eligible purchase orders that could be used for eTrackit, and also this many or this percentage of the supply chain is set up by way of CBs being ready to conduct e-transactions. So that really gives you the information you need to then go back to your supply network and say, we want to create more certified supply chains that are eligible for eTrackit before we sign up and engage. Or, there might be some certification bodies that we want to go and have conversations with and ask them, when will you be ready in this region? We have eligible supply networks, but we need this particular region to be onboarded with you. And so to be able to start those conversations with the certification bodies as well. At that point, you could then, knowing that you're ready to use the system, begin to look at the service providers, which in this case, as Evonne mentioned, is TextileGenesis, and begin to explore what an agreement with them might look like. At this point, all of the user support, the user acceptance, the troubleshooting goes through the TextileGenesis team. They'll be able to support you and help with any sort of questions that come up, all of the supplier onboarding, the registration, and being able to conduct e-transactions going forward. So the next steps for a brand who is interested is review our quick guide that will come out on the 30th to determine eligibility and readiness for the system. There's lots of great information in there about what it might look like to start to engage with your supply network, or once you receive the information about the diagnostics of your supply chain, what you should do with that information. And register for a demo drop-in session. That will also be a chance for you to ask questions about particulars in your brand supply network. And then register for the eTrackit diagnostics for the discovery for GRS and RCS if you are brand certified. We'll put the link for the registration form with the follow-up material in here. And so you'll upload a copy of your scope certificate, and then we'll be able to run through your supply chain information and provide that diagnostic report back to you. I'm going to leave these just in the presentation for material that you can review afterwards. And then if we have time at the end, we can go through some of the most commonly asked questions that we receive. But I have 2 slides here that I'll just leave for reference. I know we have a lot of questions coming in the chat here. So yeah, I will open it up for Q&A. I think we have some lined up.
Yeah, we can start with this question. If a brand wants, can they also track non-sustainable fibers in the system too? So maybe speaking to non-certified material.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So a brand is welcome to engage with TextileGenesis on that, obviously, because that is like a little bit outside of the scope of Textile Exchange standard. That is not a conversation that we'll be having with you guys. But TextileGenesis is a traceability solution provider, so you're welcome to have that conversation with them to trace your other materials, other non-certified materials. Yeah.
Okay, we can take the next one then, and it's coming back to the traceability. So, question: will brands be able to have full traceability of the end products back to the fiber stage? Currently, the TCs just track the preferred fiber content, for example, recycled, but not indicating where was the fiber manufactured nor the yarn spun. So maybe going back to traceability map there a bit.
I think those are kind of two different questions. It will have full traceability to the first supply chain input, which is within the scope of our certification. So for the case of RCS and GRS, it would be to the recycler, and then there will have some information to where based on the material declaration that comes into the recycler. But we wouldn't obviously track beyond that because that's currently outside of the scope of our standard.
I can jump in with the next question. Is there a TextileGenesis fee for suppliers to use eTrackit?
Currently, for suppliers, there is no fee. The fee is primarily more of a licensing cost for brands, and that is an arrangement that is outside of Textile Exchange, because we're not currently involved in any of the pricing or fee structure within transactions. We're also not, or transaction certificates, we're also not involved in any of the fee structure for e-transactions. So that's for the certification bodies to set. And also there is already a fee structure or licensing fee structure for brands with TextileGenesis, but it will depend on how big that brand is, the kind of volume they're expecting, how many sustainability standards or sustainability systems they want to track, etc. But no, not for suppliers.
Okay. Do brands need to have both RCS and GRS certification, or is one enough?
It depends on what they're wanting to trace back. So if they just have RCS certification, then the RCS purchases and supply network is what will be within scope. If they have both RCS and GRS, then both would be visible and in scope. If you have a mixed supply network, we did just issue a calibration regarding GRS and RCS. And so previously you did, when you added it to your scope certificate, for example, if you wanted to add RCS to a GRS scope certificate, there would be sometimes a secondary audit involved. And so we did issue a calibration recently where you're able to add RCS to your GRS scope certificate without additional, all of the additional auditing that needed to occur previously. But if you are just RCS certified as a brand and you want to see GRS information in your in the platform, then you would have to add the GRS certification to be able to view that.
And someone wants to know, is there a reason why uncertified brands are currently not able to use eTrackit? What is the reasoning behind this?
Well, because as I said, for uncertified brands, they can be onboarded by a brand through TextileGenesis for a non-certified supply chain. That's possible. I'm not saying that it's not possible. It's just not part of eTrackit because eTrackit is about tracing really a certified supply chain. So if you kind of look at how the brand or TextileGenesis as a traceability solution engages with a brand, most likely it will engage with a brand to trace the entire supply chain, part of which is certified, and that would be the eTrackit component. So it's kind of a subset of the entire traceability, if you will. And we're really only concerned and involved in the traceability of the certified supply chain.
Okay, do you have a timeline available for when to open to other service providers?
Yeah, we're looking at beginning that creating that data standards and also starting those conversations in 2024. But with respect to a hard deadline, we have yet set that in part because we do want to see how eTrackit works and what needs to be fine-tuned within TextileGenesis, because we're kind of essentially using this particular use case and then kind of expanding that across the traceability solution providers. So we do want feedback from the industry on how to basically, take the learnings from this and be able to then scale across the solution providers.
Someone is asking whether eTrackit is optional and whether this will replace TCs in the future.
Currently, we don't have firm plans to replace transaction certificates. And the industry may move in that direction. As I mentioned in my part of the presentation, there are regulations or emerging regulations that are sort of putting some of the requirements in how information is going to be transferred within the supply chain, and that may have some impact on whether transaction certificates as it is currently will need to evolve, or whether we transition completely into sort of e-transactions or various solution providers using eTrackit. But there's no firm plans to move it from transaction certificates across. And the reason, again, is the fact that if you not the entire supply chain around the world is going to be ready for such a solution right this minute, and it will take a long time for globally for the entire supply chain to move across, and that will depend on a number of drivers. And because our standard is entirely voluntary, we are kind of leaving it to the market to see how, at what speed we're going to transition.
So a question about the EU Green Deal. So do we know if the TG platform will be acceptable to meet the requirements for traceability within the EU Green Deal? For example, digital product passport. Will there be a system to chase biodivert products?
Yeah, so that's a really, really big question. So the ESPR, which is basically the regulation that is requiring the digital product passport, that isn't really finalized yet. So there is a working draft, of course, but the European Commission is still working on the final. And there are still quite a number of items in there that hasn't really been decided. For example, are they going to insist on one data carrier, or is it going to be open to any data carriers? What type of information are they going to require, in terms of traceability? Is it at every stage, or is it at key stages, or is it at, certain stages? So a lot of this information at the moment, we're still waiting. We are keeping a finger on the pulse to see what the developments are in this space. We are involved in multiple working groups and projects to make sure that whatever we develop, we'll be able to support it. But right now, it is impossible for us to answer whether it will meet or not, because we really don't know what is being asked for us to do.
We have a couple questions that are kind of, I think, all related to the difference between transaction certificates and e-transactions. And so one of the questions is, can we tell what POs have TCs and which ones are still missing TCs? Or will e-transactions at the brand stage be included in the dTrackit view? And so maybe we could just speak through a little bit the difference between transaction certificates and e-transactions and how it's not a mixed supply network. You can't have both e-transactions and TCs within the same PO.
You want to go, Callie, or you would like me to
Oh,
go?
I was posing it to you, but I can.
Okay. Okay, happy to. Yeah. So for now, anyway, e-transaction, as I said, is a closed loop supply chain. We're not mixing the two supply chains together because we want to make sure that eTrackit within the entire supply chain is kind of, as I mentioned, a zero-sum game. If 1,000 kilogram goes in, only 1,000 kilogram can go out. So until bearing in mind that transaction certificates, you are basically going a bottom up sort of way, meaning to say you have products and then all the products within the shipments, and then you have multiple shipments for a transaction certificate. Whereas with eTrackit, it's you don't really so much as monitor what shipments go within a transaction certificate. You're really looking at the transfer of the volume at the article level for a product. So you're kind of looking at a little bit of comparing apple and pear. They're both fruits, they're both hard, but it's not kind of looking at the same thing. There might be a possibility in the future that we'll be able to reconcile between the both. But for now, at least for the release, we won't be able to mix the supply chain. Yeah.
And I can add to that, part of what we're creating guidance around in that brand and supplier toolkit is what the transition expectation is. And so as Evonne mentioned, it's a fiber forward supply chain. And so a supplier could theoretically be set up for e-transactions and TCs at the same time, but not within the same purchase order. And so they could be issuing transaction certificates for certain parts of their production while also issuing e-transactions for other parts of their production while the brand is wanting to transition over, or maybe there's only certain products that ever transition over to e-transactions. But the ability to mix within a single supply chain is what won't be possible. So that's why the platforms are also separate as well. dTrackit will remain dTrackit, while the eTrackit will be platforms with different service providers so that it can be a larger traceability project. Whereas dTrackit, when you log in, what you're seeing is a reflection of the TC certification system. And then in terms of the question surrounding it looks like there's a follow-up. How will brands be able to confirm that we're receiving e-transaction data for all of the purchase orders? So that's part of the supplier onboarding process when the discovery phase is conducted. And let's say the diagnostics about your supply network say you have this many eligible purchase orders within your GRS supply network. Here's the suppliers that need to be onboarded with that. And let's say all of the certification bodies are ready to conduct e-transactions, then you would be able to go onboard all of your suppliers, and it would be a fiber forward from a certain date. They would be conducting e-transactions based on the purchase orders that are being placed. So there won't necessarily be missing e-transactions because it will be going forward in time. Is that a correct way to describe it, Evonne?
Yeah.
Great. I'll hand it back over to you, Anna.
Given that this rollout is covering GRS and RCS, will eTrackit cover non-textile materials as well?
No, sorry, I'm just going to jump in. No, textile. So one of the key things, as I mentioned, about and having the entire supply chain operate on a single solution and trying to automate as much as possible. I mentioned in my presentation that a lot of the business rules are set or baked into the roles, and the processes are also baked into the roles, which is built into the platform already. What this allows the suppliers to do in the supply chain when carrying out e-transaction is, based on your role and the type of products that you transact, certain configurations are already predetermined. So you don't really have to think too much about, oh yeah, the TC policy doesn't allow you to do this, because you won't allow you to do it inherently within the system. Now, the reason why I raise that is because for a non-fiber or non-textile type of material, the supply chain processes are very, very different. And so to be able to cater for that, you will need to define like quite a number of supply chain models and be able to map that in its entirety within the platform itself. So, I mean, to sum it up is that's not currently possible, not for the current phase, because we don't have the visibility right now to be able to understand all the different permutations of the different types of supply chains to be able to define the system. Just as a follow-on from that, that's also one of the reasons why it is important for us to not sort of do away with TCs right now, because because of the rules that are within the eTrackit model, it is inherently suitable for large volume supply chains. Whereas, because that's when your suppliers don't change very often, the transactions happen pretty much at scale. Whereas, in a supply chain where you have a lot of movements in suppliers coming in and out, that kind of product backwards to be able to define and discover your supply chain, bring it all on board, having them, then leave the next year, that may not inherently be workable for a sort of a very tailored supply chain. So, yeah.
So the next, I think, theme of questions is regarding the certification body side. So we can turn it over to that. There's a couple on a registration deadline, what training looks like for certification bodies, and then how they'll get set up with accessing the eTrackit system. So the first question is just, is there a deadline for CBs to have an account to be ready to use eTrackit? And is this information public with Textile Exchange? And that will be published in the quick guide. So we do have a registration deadline that's set forth in the eTrackit policy. It's April 1st of 2024. What that means is that certification bodies need to be registered with TextileGenesis to be users in the system. And in that registration, they're required to have completed the training that Textile Exchange has put forth. This doesn't necessarily mean that even if a certification body is trained and registered, that as a business operation, they've determined their business model around eTrackit. And so this could look different for every certification body, how they decide to regionally roll it out, where they've determined pricing and the regional ability for their team to be able to conduct e-transactions. And so part of the diagnostic process that we're working on is being able to provide that information really clearly. If you have an eligible supply network and maybe all of the certification bodies have done the training and registered, but they haven't necessarily commercially rolled out in a certain region that you're eligible for, we'll be able to provide that information to the brand so that you can see this many have conducted the training, but we need to have conversations or wait until this region is rolled out so that we can be fully set up to have eTrackit work and have the whole supply network be conducting e-transactions. So that will be part of the information that's provided back through the diagnostic process. But yes, all certification bodies need to be registered and trained in the system by April 1st. And then each certification body will figure out what their business model of rolling it out looks like. In terms of the training for the certification bodies, we're asked a question if CBs are also going to have a toolkit, so to speak. The certification body training side is a little bit different from the brand side and the supplier side, just because it's more of a normative process. This is a new way that they will be conducting transactions in the system for certified product. And so there is not necessarily a training toolkit, but the eTrackit policy is what governs certification bodies and the type of toolkit, so to speak, as to what they're used to dealing within. So the policy is what governs them. The training is what helps them understand the policy and understand the system. And then once they get registered with TextileGenesis as a user, the TextileGenesis team is who supports them in conducting e-transactions. And if they run into troubles with the system, they can always reach out. But it's essentially, I like to think of it as another mutation of a transaction certificate. It's still the same certification system in the sense that certification bodies are still governed by the standard system and the certification system. It's just instead of issuing a transaction certificate for the purchase and sale of goods, they're issuing or approving an e-transaction for the movement of material, as Evonne mentioned. So the users, Textile Exchange, accreditation bodies, all of that is still at play here. It's just a different way that the certification body will be approving transactions. And then lastly, the question was about API. So do certification bodies need some sort of API to access the system, or how do they get involved in the technology behind the system? And I'll let you speak to that, Evonne, but it doesn't need API because they're users of the system. They will have a login to be able to go in and see all of their transactions that need approving. But do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, kind of in my presentation, I did mention that information, there will be an integration from eTrackit to, so to speak, our central repository. And we already have connections with the certification body, so that the necessary information will be transferred back. But again, we're not releasing the system with API intact. What we will be doing is to provide those integration once the system is a little bit more mature and we have some, well, not at scale, but some scale and some users within supply chain, and then be able to provide that service back.
Great. Well, it looks like we're just at time now. We have some outstanding questions that we're going to take to the Hub community. So be sure to join our standard stakeholder Hub community. You can sign up for that on our website. We can also share that link in the follow-up email that goes out. But we will send out this recording along with the brand quick guide and the press release and the recording slides, everything on the 30th, and be sure to register for our demo drop-in sessions that are coming up in the month of December. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.